Right. So I think we should probably get started because I know we have a packed agenda. This is a great conversation, though. I'm sorry to stop it. I'm just going to lead off by telling you all, in case you don't know me, although I see so many friendly faces here. My name is Megan Carter, and I'm ESIP's Community Director. I'm here in a support role today, along with Alexis Garrettson, one of our most awesome ESIP Community Fellows. And before we get to the fun part, I wanted to remind you of a few things. First of all, this session is being recorded. It's also being live streamed to YouTube. We welcome those of you who are tying in that way. As you know, we're using Zoom here, so for most of you, you should be well acquainted with this, but just in case this is your first time in Zoom or you'd like a refresher, there's a toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window that you should see, and there you'll see a button for chat and a button for participant windows. If you click these, they'll open and you'll be able to follow activity there. We ask that you please mute when you're not speaking. If you're like me, you have a computer that's trying to take off and fly somewhere, so I will keep quiet so you don't hear my fan. And then cameras off during presentations, cameras on during discussion. If you're willing to have your camera on, that helps to encourage people to talk to one another. I want to remind you of ESIP's community participation guidelines. We take very seriously how people behave in our spaces, and these are a nice set of guidelines to help you navigate what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior in ESIP, and importantly, there's a place for you to report, to make anonymous reports, and to find out more about this. So I also want to point out that this session has a very nice agenda that you can see in the Kiko chat tab if you are logged in there, and I believe Val or Sarah could also, sure, I'll do it momentarily, share a direct link to that document as well if you don't have that tab open anymore. So I think that's everything I had to say, so enjoy and welcome.
Thank you very much, Megan, for the introduction to the session. So for those of you who might not know me, my name is Sarah Ramdeen. I work at Columbia for Kirsten Leonard, who happens to be in the room. I work on CSAR, the System for Earth Sample Registration. And the inspiration for this session with my co-host Val Stanley and Kelly Stroker, who's unable to be here, is the conversation around physical samples. And this idea that we were being playful in our title, that samples are often like a secondary thought to a lot of these conversations on how we're supporting fair access to data, fair access to science materials, and making data count, and these different initiatives that there's often someone in the back going, and samples, like, don't forget about us. And we really wanted to talk about whether or not there needed to be a specific community to have these conversations and have them focused around samples themselves, as opposed to perhaps being that and samples attached to a conversation somewhere else. So that's sort of the sort of bite-sized synopsis of why we wanted to have a session, sorry. And to sort of go over the agenda, what we're going to do first is Val's going to give a presentation with a longer, richer discussion on the background for this potential cluster. Then we're going to go into a number of breakouts where we'll discuss some ideas of, well, what is the community that needs to be represented? What are the issues that community is having? And do we feel like, given those previous discussions, there's enough there to actually form a community? Then we'll come back and have that as a larger group discussion and make some decisions about if we're going to actually submit a cluster statement to form a physical samples cluster. And before we get into the presentation, one homework request that while Val's doing her presentation, if you could go into the notes document, we've got a table set up that is capturing people's names and also the types of samples they represent. You don't necessarily have to give your name if you don't want to be added to a contact list, but we would really like to capture the variety of samples that are being represented by the ESIP community so we can better understand, again, the community that might be part of this cluster or that we want to speak for. Are there any other business notes, Val, before we jump into the presentation?
I think that is a really great introduction. I think that's pretty much everything.
All right, then I'm going to mute myself. And then after your presentation, Val, we'll discuss a little bit more about how the breakouts will work.
That sounds great. So hi, everybody. My name is Val Stanley. I'm the Antarctic Core Curator here at the Oregon State University Marine and Geology Repository. So I take care of a collection of deep ocean sediment samples from the Southern Ocean that have been collected since the 1960s up until even this year in 2020, we've been receiving samples. from research cruises down there. So I just wanted to quickly go over sort of the motivation and how this conversation began of what do we need a cluster and what would we talk about and what conversations would go into that and what do we want to do. So just a little bit of background for you here, sharing my screen. Okay. Everybody see my screen okay?
Yes, looks great.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Val Stanley, here with Sarah Ramdeen, and Kelly couldn't be here with us. She works at NCEI, and so there'll be more about her piece of this puzzle later. So yeah, I am one of many marine core sediment curators. There's a couple of them here in the room, I believe. And so, yeah, we've been a group since the 70s that hasn't really had a home anywhere else other than a meeting that we have every other years. The first meeting was in 1977 at Scripps, talking about some very similar themes to other sessions here at ESIP. So standardizing things, techniques for sharing and curating samples. So yeah, the idea there being these are samples collected via various funding sources that should be shared and maintained for future research, as they can be used for multiple analyses now and in the future, things that we haven't even envisioned yet. And that these are super important, like many research repositories, not just physical sample repositories. Yeah, and so discussion topics over the past 40 years have been remarkably similar, thinking about things like deaccessioning. What things can we keep? Which things do we deaccession or dispose of? Space concerns. I think these are questions that are not unique to us as marine sediment core curators, but for various kinds of samples and data. What do we do about collections that have been orphaned and need a place to live and be properly cared for and curated and shared? And then also large sample rescues. So what do you do when a university can no longer maintain a community resource, such as the sample collection, which I actually am taking care of. We relocated it from Florida. So that's a great story and is useful to the community. But, you know, what do we do in the future when these things happen? Yeah, a lot of repositories are short on space. I'm sure that there are a lot of heads nodding. And it's not just core sediment repositories like this photo here. And there are a lot of costs that are involved with that in terms of maintaining the collection's storage conditions. So, you know, we maintain everything at 37 degrees Fahrenheit so that we can keep things moist. And that's not cheap for the university. I don't know why I duplicated that. Yeah, so that's a bit about the deep ocean sediment core community, but we realize that this is an important thing nationally, as samples are part of our nation's heritage. This is just a little snippet from the NRC report from 2002, which has a lot of really great use cases explaining how these samples can be so critical and full of information now and in the future, and how really maintaining them is a great investment. And so curation, this is something we're all talking about here, not just for physical samples, and that is really kind of the sum of preservation and access activities. And for us, for preservation goals of these sediment cores, we want to keep them in their original moist condition as long as possible. But I'm sure that there are other preservation techniques out there relevant to different kinds of samples as well. But those goals probably have similar reasons, that we want to maintain the samples for reproducibility reasons, and kind of for what I like to call green science. You know, it's easier to revisit a sediment core collected in 1985 from the Southern Ocean than it is to go back down there and go grab another one. And yeah, so this cost of preserving the materials, paying for me, paying for the facility, is far cheaper and longer lasting than recollecting over and over again. With the Southern Ocean as a pretty extreme example of that. And then promoting access. We want to have a state-of-the-art facility, and I'm sure everybody else does too, that you can care for your samples as best you can with the resources available, and how to make sure that those are accessible both in person physically as well as digitally via the web. And for the same reasons, again, make sure that these samples are useful in the future as well. The digital preservation that I was talking about in terms of making sure that things are accessible physically and digitally, those principles are the same, I would argue, for physical samples as well as their associated digital data products. And these samples become more and more valuable as we analyze them and describe them in various ways and publish on those things. So fair data principles certainly apply here for the samples as well. There was a survey that went out a couple years ago, and all you need to know here is that these very cool hex diagrams are showing that a lot of people in the community feel that samples are important to be shared. Sharing them is important, but that it's really a difficult and challenging thing to do. So that's recognized already and is not unique to just large institutional repositories, but for smaller collections as well. Working on persistent identifiers and making that a part of workflows, both for institutional repositories and for others, I'm sure, using the IGSN and making that a part of our everyday life, and recognizing the links between those identifiers and other existing ones and keeping those links tracked properly. So I guess talking more about then coming back to the inspiration for this discussion is the IMLGS, which is the Index to Marine and Lacustrine Geological Samples, which is a community resource on the web that shares information about samples. It's honestly, as far as I can tell, in the user community, it's a known resource that people go to try and find information. So locations for over 200,000 samples, depending on what you define as a sample. That has associated pictures, may or may not have other associated data sets that people are looking for. And just knowing where those samples are housed, which is really important, and honestly how I ended up getting to know the community associated with my collection, is that folks reach out after consulting this webpage that's been around since the 70s, collecting as much information as they can. And this is also where Kelly Stroker comes in, as she's been sort of overseeing this resource. But the breaking news this week is that they've hired another person to continue working on this database in the future. So Clint Edrington will be another person to bring into this conversation in the future as well. So yeah, you can access it pretty easily by Googling IMLGS. And it has a map. You can search in and filter in various other ways. And you can get to it through various other web services, which can be pretty handy. Yeah, so the conversation with the curators has kind of been, so where do we go with the IMLGS, as it's kind of been not as frequently maintained and updated. There's concerns about how you add things to the website. There's just some clunky things going on there. And so it would be great to have a different way to import things there and maintain the records there, as well as via CSAR, so that everybody, even their home institutional databases, can all be live and it's not a duplicative effort. Recognizing that all of these resources are equally important. So goals and future work for the INLGS was to kind of find a new way to update that relational database and web map service, add some other options for that, and what does the community need? So at that point, the discussion was, what do this group of curators want to see to help share their samples? But then it was petitioned, this is a lot of work, and there's ways to keep the conversation going rather than a meeting every other year. So the idea kind of came up about, what's a home for this group of these folks that have been working together for years on very similar issues from their various institutions. So the idea from the amazing Megan Carter was to think about an ESIP cluster and what would that be and who would join it? What sorts of efforts are we trying to streamline? So an initial idea was, doing a comparison of vocabularies between repositories, the INLGS, and CSAR vocabularies. And I know there was a lot of really awesome discussion going on yesterday at the plenaries about vocabularies, and that was very encouraging. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from everybody about where this could go and what would be most helpful for everyone. So yeah, thank you all. There we go. And that's that.
Thank you so much, Val. Just as a note too, that I'm trying to figure out the phrasing I'm looking for. That example from the IMLGS was what Kelly was going to present, and she's unable to be here. But it's the idea that the inspiration for this. Oh, sorry, I just realized my mic was up. Hope you could hear me. The inspiration for this cluster came out of, there's this existing group of curators that meets every 2 years within the marine and equestrian environment and talks about these issues, and they're doing great work, but it is an infrequent meeting. And it's also the idea that not just are they having these issues, but there are other areas expanding that topic outward for other people working with physical samples that would also benefit from either having that similar connection, similar group of a focused community that might come together, have discussions, and be able to move forward on issues. And so I think it was a combination of starting off initially in that group and saying, how could we better support that group? And then also how can we could expand that and better support everyone working with samples within, and then potentially within the ESIP community.
So
are there any questions?
Yeah. How do you see the connection to the RDA interest group on physical samples?
That is a good question. I don't know if we've discussed a direct connection. I do think that this might be more for the everyday, like repository manager or everyday person, whereas I think that the conversations in the RDA group tend to be more on the policymaker level, if that makes sense. Or maybe that's because of the audience, the RDA is a bit different than what you see in the ESIP community. Val, did you have any thoughts about that?
Not right away, but it's a really great question. So I'm making myself an actual physical note about that because I want to.
Yeah, and that we should coordinate with that group in whatever way moving forward. Yes. Ted?
Yeah, Christian, can you give us a like a 30-second nutshell on what that group has done or is in process of doing?
Well, it's been around for, I think, 3 years now, meets at the RDA plenaries, obviously. It had also run a side event at RDA, a full-day workshop that focused on metadata, on persistent identifiers, on structures of metadata, and so on. It has been a broader effort in trying to bring together any discipline that deals with samples. So we've had people from agriculture, from biomedical sciences dealing with tissue samples, human tissue, animal tissue, and archaeology, lots of different communities to look at common best practices and the typical metadata issue of core commonalities versus domain-specific vocabularies. It's been reporting on activities that are going on internationally and nationally in the field of samples. I think we've had about 4 or 5 different sessions at the RDA plenaries. So, I mean, I think I just wanted people to be aware of that group because I think, and Sarah put that very, very nicely, it could work at a complementary level to whatever is happening in this cluster. But it's something to consider because you also don't want to fragment the landscape of sample discussions too much.
Right, and I think that this sort of came up in, I forget which plenary discussion, it was the research objects for credit session, where that definition of what is a sample, what is a specimen, and how that can vary so much from community to community, and that within ESIP we want to discuss what that means within our communities, and that might be different than the broader umbrella that RDA is encompassing. And so we might need to then have our conversations here and have that represented within the overall RDA discussions, but it might be a more narrow focused here as well. Any other questions before we transition into the breakout portion?
One question is, do you want this to be focused on like curators who are actually maintaining physical samples, or also including like data curators who are working on the like preservation of the sample metadata and data over time, as opposed to the actual sample itself?
Yes, and also that was a perfect plant question for the first breakout. So that's sort of what we want to discuss. So who is the community? What would it entail? Who is it? Just one thing? Is it both? Is it like, that's what we want to capture from you guys in this first discussion. And so we've got 2 ideas, and I want to put it to a vote. I'm not sure if anyone here has used the voting yet before, but if you click on participants, you should be able to see your name and you can vote yes or no. Let's say that I'm going to give you 2 options. We'll say that option 1 is yes and option 2 is no. Is that the best way, I guess, to vote? Where the first option is that in these 3 breakouts, you'll stay in the same group for each breakout and continue the discussion. We have 3 discussions. The first is on the purpose of the group, how we're defining what the community means. The second is focused on, well, what are the issues now that you've identified in this community that you've identified? Seems redundant, but what are the specific topics? Vocabularies has been a hot topic, not just at this ESIP, but within many of the folks I've talked to who are in this room. And then the third breakout is going to be then, okay, now that you've had these 2 conversations, do you feel there's enough to justify having a cluster? Did you look at the cluster statement? Do you think that it's adequate? Is it missing something? If you don't think that there should be a specific cluster for samples, do you think it should be instead attached to an existing cluster and have that sort of discussion? And so the idea with this voting is you're going to vote that yes, during all 3 of these conversations, I want to stay in the same group. I think we'll get rich discussion. Or option 2 would be, we'll randomize the rooms each time, and that way you'll get new people, new discussions, and being able to get different perspectives with each phase of the conversation. So again, if you could vote for which one of those you prefer to do for these breakouts, with yes being stay in the same group and no being randomize the groups each time. I'll give everyone just a minute to do that voting. Say if we end up with a 50-50 split, guys, this is going to be hard.
Could you repeat it one more time?
Sure. Asking you to vote with yes being I want to stay in the same group and have a focused discussion throughout the 3 breakout discussions, and no being to prefer to each of the 3 rounds be randomized and have a new set of people to have the conversation with.
But I don't have a button to push for
If
yes
you
or
go
no.
to participants and click on the participant list, you should have a yes or no button highlighted at the bottom
Oh,
of that list.
there, I see. Okay.
So question, Sarah, how big are you thinking of having the breakouts? I mean, is this 2 groups, 3 groups? We're not a very big group to start
I was
with.
thinking 3 groups, but like 6 people group, that way it's not too small and not too big. I felt like 9 would be too big a split.
I think 3 sounds great.
Yeah, 3 groups, yeah. So we could have those, we could do it that way if everyone votes, depending on what you vote in, you can get put into a room that fits that discussion base. So far we've got 11, there's 18, oh, someone disappeared. There's 17 of us, so some of you haven't voted yet. I should vote. I was gonna abstain, but.
So I think, would it help, Sarah, if I said a couple words about ESIP clusters? I think most people here are pretty familiar with them, but I think having this question about do we need a physical samples cluster, it does depend on knowing a little bit about the clusters and what makes a cluster more or less successful. And you know, these are my perspective observations as the community director for the last couple of years, but you know, clusters can have a wide range of focuses. Some are more technical, some are more application area based. Some are broader, sort of like an open hour of discussion once a month that a group wants to have, and that can work very nicely for them. Those groups sometimes will bring in a speaker now and again, and it's just kind of a place for information sharing. The groups that I've seen be most successful, kind of regularly drawing a large crowd and just more energy, seem to have very focused, targeted goals, you know, the development of a white paper or just a slightly more targeted activity. And a cluster could have phases, you know, where you're in kind of a webinar information sharing phase, and then at one point maybe you have a more targeted activity. But I think, you know, what you've mentioned falls on both ends of the spectrum, right? A community that you're almost suggesting a community practice or something to support the curators. But on the other hand, you're suggesting a very targeted metadata effort that I think falls on the other end of that. And that's the piece of it that maybe might overlap with some other existing ESIP clusters, such as the documentation cluster. And so as folks are thinking about these questions, I think it's good to know where the overlaps are and the wide range of possibilities here, I guess.
Yeah, and that's why we sort of set the first 2 discussions as separate of what is the community and then what are the actions that are needed in order to perhaps have some foundation to a group, a focus to a group.
I think it's also good to know, like, the cluster is what the people who show up make it. So we don't want to create something and hope they'll come to it, but think about who's here and what would keep you coming back.
Right. And yeah, that in our closing discussion, we're going to request you all volunteer to help with efforts. We're going to identify what the action items are based on the discussion, and then hopefully get some volunteers to contribute. Okay. So let's go with majority rule and just put, if you can randomize this into 3 groups, and then we'll stay in the same group for each breakout. The first breakout is going to be 10 minutes where you'll discuss and fill in for your group, pick a slide for breakout session 1 and fill in the discussion points there. There's a series of questions to trigger the conversation, and I can put a link in the chat with that. And then after 10 minutes, we'll come back. Each group will very briefly, just give us some highlights before you're kicked back into your group. And after that first round, if we find that reporting isn't necessary until the end, we can always skip the next reporting block. Okay. So you'll have 10 minutes to really discuss what the community might be for physical samples and address some of the points that Joan brought up of, is it the curators? Is it people doing data management? Is it both?
I'm going to open the rooms, and you're welcome to join them when you're ready. And I'll see you in about 10 minutes.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
If you don't like where you are, you can always come back.
Have a little bit better sense of scope for sure, but there's enthusiasm, and the community could be broader than just sample curators, but including library folks, museum folks. Yeah.
Okay, great. And from group 2, do you guys just want me to say something quickly, unless someone else wants to do it? Okay, no one unmuted. So yeah, group 2, we saw the same thing we saw as curators, but also those who collect samples that might need curation in the future, and that there were a lot of issues around data linking, provenance, integration, like these different things around curation and maintenance, and wanting to be able to highlight those as efforts. And then we thought, yes, there's enough diversity of issues with samples to have its own group alone, even though it is connected to a lot of other existing clusters. How about group 3?
I can give a quick summary of what we talked about. So I think I was group 3. Yes, group C. So we said, yes, it would be great to have an independent cluster, but we would want to maintain coordination with existing clusters like research object citation, data stewardship, and as well as like the external organizations, maybe like RDA or iDigBio. And we said that the community could be fairly broad, both in terms of roles, like collectors, curators, as well as repositories, both sample and data, but also should be potentially relatively broad in terms of subject area, like both including biological and geophysical, and that might be a potential way for us to focus the cluster, to think about how to crosswalk or bridge the vocabularies and ontologies in use in different subsections of the physical samples world.
And I think that's a perfect segue too now to move into the next breakout. So we're going to do this again, 10 minutes, and then come back to quickly report. And mostly that's to kind of keep you on track with the conversation on what you think now are these issues that should be focused on within this group. Definitely, I imagine vocabularies is going to be popular, and we're interested in hearing more information about that, so we can capture that to turn that maybe into action items, but be open to other concerns as well. So yeah, so Megan, if you could put us back into rooms, and then same thing, 10 minutes, breakout session to your group A, B, or C. Make some notes.
All right.
Okay, and we're back. So we want, again, we're going to do this like very brief, just to sort of get an idea, everyone understanding what the other groups are talking about, a 1-minute report out from each group on what they're doing, and then we're going to go back into breakout groups again. So I'll ask you to give a brief talk about what your group discussed, and then also if you want to stay in the same group, or if you think it'd be worthwhile to mix it up for this last one. So someone from group 1, room 1.
Anybody else want to speak for the room? Just in general, I feel like we had a really great brainstorm overall of just like really great topics broadly that are important and need attention. So
most of it's in the slide, I think.
Yeah, they all listed. I think there's a combination of technical issues and procedural or policy issues with respect to samples.
And do you guys think it'd be fruitful to stay in your same group for the final conversation?
What is the final conversation?
We're going to review the existing version of the cluster statement and see if how it should be expanded.
Uh-oh. Where is that statement?
I'll drop it in. Let's move to, you guys think about that. We'll move to group B and C, and then we'll maybe decide whether at the end. So does someone else want to speak for group B, or do you guys want me to do that? Okay, hearing no objections. So we had some similar ideas where we had a lot of things around like cyber infrastructure, data management, these more modern curation activities, as well as still there's questions around the archival practices for how do you figure out the environmental conditions? How are you developing your 100-year archive? And things like that are like the physical activities, and also bringing in the modern curation work. Part of it was also returned to a conversation about funding. like getting the funding to do the work and to be future thinking, while making it easy for the current managers to accept any practices that might come out of this group. So that's where we were sort of thinking, and we've got a bunch of different things captured in the slides. And how about group 3, group C?
Okay, I can go. So we talked probably unsurprisingly about vocabularies and thinking about vocabularies at sort of a high level and focusing more on the things that are shared between different types of physical samples across fields and how we can work those together. And then within that, we were talking about roles and how important it is to define roles for things like provenance tracking and credit attribution questions. And coming out of that, we talked about like citations and then how to map these different parts to how best to cite subsets of samples, how best to cite samples for credit attribution as well as for identification and reproducibility. And then our last couple little things that came up were, I mean, I say little, but getting usage and uptake with PIs and collectors and trying to help support leading practices going from the data curation world to the on the ground folks, as well as support how do we best support small institutions and developing recommendations for how and when you should assign persistent identifiers and how best to link related samples.
All right, great. So for this last breakout, what you're going to do is you're going to look at, and I put it in the chat, a link to the cluster statement that we've currently drafted. And we want to know what's missing, what can be improved. So part of the conversation was, do we think it's viable to have a cluster? I have a feeling that's probably a yes. So at this point, it's making recommendations for how to improve the cluster statement so that we could submit it. So the document is set up as, I think it should allow you to suggest, or at least just put comments on it. So please either capture your feedback in the slide, or you can put them directly as comments on that document. And I'm going to suggest, I guess, we stay in the same groups unless there's any objections and anyone thinks they'd benefit from mixing things up for this final breakout.
Hey, Megan, could you say something about the role of the cluster statement?
Yes. Thank you, Ted. So this is pretty much the pitch for the cluster that it used to be just a very send a sentence essentially to the vice president to get your cluster approved. It's supposed to be pretty easy to start one of these, but this is a set of questions that, based on my observations, they're the kinds of things I would want to know as someone who's going to support the cluster. This is kind of your best initial thoughts on the topic. Again, it can be further honed once the cluster exists based on who shows up, but you know, this is, think of it as like you all are potential initial participants. How can your voice be in here somewhere? And you've thought of so many good things today. So Ted, do you feel like that was what
Yep.
you were envisioning?
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then let's go back to our same groups for 10 minutes. And then the goal when we come back now is then to now have this conversation as a larger group where you can share some of these things of recommendations for the cluster statement, and then we can start looking for volunteers and maybe highlight if you felt there was an activity that came out from all of your discussions that should be the focus of the group. So yes, another 10 minutes in the same breakout groups, Megan, would be great.
Great. And one more comment before I let you guys go. This is something that we want clusters to update periodically, maybe once a year, maybe slightly more often if it seems reasonable. So it should be kind of a living document representing what you're working towards. Okay, enough for me.
No, this is helpful.
See you all soon. Wrong button, but everyone should be back in a moment. It's
okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. We can have our own 30 seconds of hangout. I think, yeah, well, so I don't know, we were previously group C, but then Sarah was typing in C, so I started to type in D, so hopefully that's not confusing for them.
I'm sure, as long as the information is captured, that's awesome.
Okay, great. And if I miss anything, my group can fill it in.
Mm-hmm.
So, Okay, I'm gonna go back into mute.
Oh, this is great. I want to start off by apologizing to Group C because I realized I was accidentally editing your slide with my thoughts instead of the one for Group B. So I apologize. That was totally my fault.
Sarah, that's okay. I was writing in D. So for my group, if I missed anything, I accidentally jumped out of the room and I was like, where am I? So if I missed, take a look at the slide. So if I missed any notes, you can add it in.
I know we had a few people drop, but is everyone back from all of the rooms then? Because we're down now 4 people and I know 2 people had to leave, but check before we hop back into things. So how did that go? Group A, what'd you think?
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was tough to, if you hadn't read the statement in advance, to read it quickly through everything. I think the group had comments about broadening the scope, that the introductory paragraph could be adjusted, just reordered with emphasis on a broader scope. You know, really open up the possibility to have multiple working groups within the cluster, because there seem to be parallel activities and some people focused on one specific activity, but interested in learning about other focus areas as well.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Ted.
Yep. Sorry, we got yanked away from a discussion of meeting frequency, and in the statement it says meeting every 2 months, and I was just saying that sometimes in these cluster histories, enthusiasm is higher at the beginning, so it might be better to think about monthly meetings at least at the beginning, and that might also help you define more clearly the scope and maybe identify some of these working groups or working topics that Kirsten was mentioning. Yeah, just in terms of the group dynamics and trying to get things done.
Mm-hmm. All right, yeah, and I want to say that Group B, unless anyone else wants to chime in, we really felt the same way, that the language could really be trim off some of the specifics to make it more broadly supporting, specifically from folks from the bio community that are represented within ESIP, and that a lot of the same issues will come up, but then they can just take it and make it for their flavor, and also not just their flavor, but also the size. Like there was some focus in the text on larger institutions, but smaller institutions can use the materials coming out of this as well. Let's see. And one, yeah, then we just added a few other topics that we might address in the group. How about Group C?
So we certainly had those similar discussions about expanding the scope to non-geological collections and also the size. Maybe we benefit from having smaller collections as well. And then certainly developing tools. The tools need to just, like Mars is a great example, but it's developed just for marine and lake databases. So we'd like to expand it to more terrestrial capabilities for those samples. What should be expanded on? We think there should be a clear vision of the tools we want and the functions that we want them to have. And then we need to expand on the link between samples and analytical results. And our general comments are like, this is great, let's not start from scratch. And then there's so many commonalities between the different repositories and different data types. This should just be a great benefit and resource. I probably missed some things there, but
hopefully if you got it in the notes, well, you can then, what we'll do is Val and Kelly and I will go back and revise that statement and incorporate all of these ideas that are listed as suggestions on the document, and then they're captured in the 3 breakouts in the slides, and consolidate that information into a revised both cluster statement. Sorry, I keep wanting to use the terminology from RDA of case and statements. And then also maybe make some suggestions as far as from what you did in group session 2 of first activities the group might look at to say, here are some ideas that came up that seem to be very important, common across groups. We want to pitch them out as the first sort of activities we might work on, and then maybe get feedback on that as well. So, and maybe that's what we can do now. We've got 12 minutes left, and we wanted to really bring it back together and now let everyone have that conversation together. Was there something that came up in one of your groups that you're like, yeah, we want to work on this? Let's talk about it in more detail as a group. Everyone's really quiet, because if not, I have 2 things I'll say. One, the Mars middleware that was mentioned by Mickey, we're going to have a Funding Friday poster on it tomorrow to pitch the idea of getting some funding to help the students who work on it to expand it to support other vocabularies, other communities. So if you are able to take part in the voting process tomorrow, we would love it to support that project. And the other thing is that in the proliferation of vocabularies plenary yesterday, it feels like longer, was it yesterday? Yeah, there was a discussion about a vocabulary sprint and the idea of having a home for a community to have a conversation around. There are lots of vocabulary needs for physical samples. Can we have a focused activity where we spend 2 weeks where people work together virtually on a technical sprint related to that? And I was wondering how that felt as maybe an activity that might be a first activity for this cluster.
Well, yeah, Sarah, I was going to chime in and say I think vocab is something that needs to be addressed first, but I didn't want to be the one to say it. But yeah, I think a virtual sprint would be a good idea. I think, and then one thing to mention about Mars, I kicked myself out of our room. But yeah, so the idea with Mars is that it would take any data format, so even if it is terrestrial. But that's something that the index to marine and lacustrine geological samples lacks right now, because it's lake and marine and lacustrine. So yeah, and that middleware has come a really long way in being able to link 2 different multidisciplinary vocabularies together.
Alex, is there a link that those of us who aren't educated could become more educated on Mars? It's not a great search term.
No, I know. Yeah, you get a lot of cool images of rovers.
Yeah, I guess there's a planet named Mars.
What you should be looking for is circles.
I'll put a link in the chat.
Yeah.
Gary already has. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So
that's
the
obvious.
overarching activity from Jim Bowering at Carolina.
Yeah, it's so Dr. Jim Bowering, we met at an EarthQ meeting back in DC years ago, well, 4 or 5 years ago now. And so he's built this this middleware with solely undergraduate support at the College of Charleston. And they've gotten this far with about just $1,500 of money tossed in. But their local institution is supporting their server much better now. So and the model was that they took my data from Scripps, but that data was literally exported from NOAA's Index to Marine and Lacustrine geological samples, and then it was mapped to fields in SASAR that are required when you need to go in and upload data so that you can get an IGSN, and then it juts out, a formatted file with the IGSN, so you could just send that right back to NOAA, and bada bing, bada boom. So after a few years, it's actually ready to go live in just a week or so. Fingers crossed.
And I think that middleware and that solution is part of the larger conversation, though, too. Like, we've had discussions in other sessions about, well, what is a sample and how is it defined? What are the different types of things that are recognized as samples or not? And what are the metadata needs around those? And that came up a lot with, I don't know if any of you saw Joan's presentation in the research showcase and the work that she's been doing. And not to put you on the spot, Joan, but just some of the ideas that once you start to capture metadata about a physical sample, there's not necessarily good, clear, controlled vocabularies or resources for all of the different things that you need to make it more interoperable with other data. Let's see. So we've got about 5 minutes left do we want to, are there any, so because I've sort of pitched the vocabulary thing as a potential action item for the group, we also wanted to look for some volunteers. Is there any interest in anyone here who might want to be a co-chair of the proposed cluster? And also anyone who's like, yes, I definitely want to, I've got some action and activities I want to take part in.
I'm happy to contribute wherever you might need somebody, but if there are others to step up, I'm also happy to stay back.
Well,
Sarah, I'd really like to be involved. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Alexis. I think since Kelly, didn't show up, she should definitely be a co-chair.
Yeah, that's true.
Multiple co-chairs is a good thing. Those groups that seem to make the most progress have more leaders.
Yeah, I'm also happy to help too in any way. So feel free to ping on me.
Yeah, me too.
And I'm definitely quite interested in staying engaged as well. I think a lot of the work that that my funding from USGS, the NGGDPP, and data preservation work for our state geological survey is extremely cyber infrastructure for samples management focused. So a lot of this work, I'm sure, can benefit that very substantially, and is quite coincident. So this is where I'm already putting an enormous amount of effort and would love to continue to coordinate that through a broader group to broaden the impact.
I'm happy to be an Indian in this group. But one thing that happened, Jason, my brain is a little bit tired this week, but aren't you an LTER guy?
I don't know what that means.
Okay, you're not. But there have been a number of long-term ecological research.
Oh yes, I'll take
long-term program
in my lab.
In your lab?
Yeah.
So I wonder if there are people from LTER who are doing, integrating some kind of sample stuff. There's, 20.
Brenna's really involved with Symbiota, and Symbiota does a lot of the natural history collections management for physical samples or natural history samples.
Who is really associated with it?
Corinna?
Oh.
Raina.
Raina, yeah, okay.
I've only ever seen her name on the internet.
Raina from Canada?
Jenkins? Raina Jenkins?
Alexis said Corinna, and she meant Corinna Grease, I think. Alexis.
Corinna Grease.
Yeah.
Oh.
So,
okay.
Two good people, though.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, definitely Corinna is running the EDI for all the LTERs. So that's, and then, but there's a good representation of, through Joan, I think, of the biogeochemistry community.
Yeah, I know she's really involved with EDI, but she's also been really involved with Symbiota, and I think the Symbiota work is much more relevant to this group than necessarily.
I should mention, I mean, we haven't heard back from NSF, but there is a proposal pending called Sampling Nature, which is an interdisciplinary effort. It was submitted to the Bio Directorate after consulting with NSF. But that's an RCN to focus on all of the topics that have been brought up here. Policies for samples, better access, better infrastructure, technical issues, and bringing different communities together. So the thing was submitted in early May, and we haven't heard back yet. The lead PI is Ramona Waltz at the University of Arizona.
I think that's great, both what you're mentioning, Kirsten, and also what Gary mentioned, that being able to have maybe a space within the cluster too to talk about projects that are ongoing in other environments that might get adopted or expanded for other communities.
There seems to be a lot going on. I mean, the iSamples project has just been funded by NSF and is starting in August, so in a week from now. So there's lots of projects happening at the same time, and having this as a coordinating and communicating forum is a really great opportunity.
I'm just writing that down because I want to add that as a thing, the coordination and the communication as a venue. Well, I do want to thank you all. This is wonderful. We've gotten a lot of really good feedback on the cluster statement. I didn't even have to ask if we felt it was viable to have its own cluster, because I think from the conversations and the reportings from the breakouts, it was clear that this is a passionate group that has its own needs and its own activities around it. So Val and I will meet with Kelly and we'll work on revising the statement and sharing it out with those of you. We've captured your email address in the notes document. And hopefully maybe through other channels in ESIP, so this can get to people who are unable to attend this specific session. But I don't think I have anything else to add. Val, do you have anything you want to say just in closing?
I was just going to say thank you, because this has been great.
Yeah.
And I appreciate all your perspectives, and it's been really cool to see, even just in my little group, what people have to say. So I'm excited to go through all that and keep working with all of you.